everyone. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the second lecture of Discovering Linguistic Discoveries. Thank you very much for coming, and thank you very much to Professor Heycock for being here. I just very briefly introduce Professor Heycock. You know it already. She's professor of syntax at the University of Edinburgh, and her research focuses on theoretical syntax. And she has been working for several years about variation and change in syntax in Faroese. And this evening she will talk about, she will introduce us to linguistic change in the North Atlantic. Thus, we will investigate modern Faroese. Thank you very much, and I leave you the floor.
Thank you. Well, first, is the sound okay for everyone at the back? You're all right? Yeah? First, I'd like to thank you very much for inviting me to your university. It's a real privilege to be here and to get to talk to you. So thank you indeed. And yes, what I want to talk about is recent work that I've been doing together with a number of colleagues, looking in particular at Faroese. And to some extent, this is a story about how it can be that interest in fairly, what my parents and my sisters at least consider to be quite obscure topics, that is, in my case, syntax, and an interest in change and why and how it is that languages change. How it can be that one day you're sitting in the library thinking about this and reading dissertations and articles and getting an idea, and as a result you find yourself a few years later preparing to bicycle 6 kilometers underneath the North Atlantic. You'll see that I'm well prepared. I have lots and lots of reflective gear. So this is, I'm here in the Faroe Islands and about to descend through one of the numerous tunnels that aid people in getting around the islands. So how could it be that you get from sitting in a library to being in this rather cold and windy but extremely beautiful country? In my case, it happened because, as I said, I'm interested both in syntax and also I have an interest in language change. So one of the best established facts about languages is that they're not stable. And in fact, one of the best established, or the longest established subparts of linguistics is the study of sound change. So we've known for well over a century, longer than that in fact, how to investigate in detail how over time the sounds in a language can change, dialects can diverge in the sounds, until you wind up in a situation where you have not just different dialects, but languages which are mutually unintelligible, and the same process can repeat, and you'll wind up with a whole variety of languages. We know clearly this is what happened. This is why we have, well, this is why is perhaps overstating it. This is how we wind up with a situation that we have English distinct from Flemish, distinct from French, distinct from German, distinct from Faroese. This has been studied for a long time. We know a lot about sound change, the systematic way in which this works and how languages diverge. We haven't known for nearly so long about how it is that syntax changes, so how the grammar of languages changes over time. But it's still clear that it does. That much we know. So if you look at Latin, and you look at the word orders in Latin, you'll see that the verb is at the end of the sentence typically. You look at the languages that descended from Latin, that's no longer true. They're mostly subject, verb, object languages. So something has changed also in the syntax. But it's only relatively recently in the progress of linguistics that we've come to understand enough about syntax to be able to start looking at those processes, the process whereby syntax of languages changes over time in the same way that sound changes over time. So this is a very exciting time, I think, to be looking at syntactic change. And sometime over the last 30, maybe even only 20 years, we're starting to get a handle on how you could study how syntax changes over time. And one case that has been very well studied in the history of English is a change in the possible position of verbs. In the case of English, it's actually a change in the position of a large subclass of verbs, the non-auxiliary verbs. And what's changed, as many of you will probably know, is that in older forms of English, so in Old English, in Middle English, if you look at where the verb is in the sentence with respect to other things, if you look specifically at where the verb is with respect to the marker for negation, in modern English, not, or the clitic form, nt, what you find is in the older forms of English, all verbs can precede negation. So they come to the left in the orthographic representation. So here are examples, the first two examples here from early modern English. He said darkness and made it dark, and they rebelled not against his word. In the same way, in the second sentence, who knoweth not. Now these are clearly not possible in modern English. Instead you get the forms they did not rebel or who doesn't know. So something has changed in the syntax. Possible order of the verbs like rebel and know, the order with respect to the negative has changed. Something else has happened as well, which was introduced this do. That's an additional complication, which is clearly related. So that's a change that's happened in the history of English, and it's been looked at a lot because we have quite a lot of documentation of English, and people have been studying the syntax of English for quite some time. But something very similar also happened in Scandinavian. At least it happened in some of Scandinavian. So this change, or what looks like the same change, happened in the mainland varieties of Scandinavian. That is, in at least the standard varieties of Danish, of Swedish, and of Norwegian. So this example here is from, the first example is from Middle Danish, and I'm not going to try to pronounce this, but what you see here is, so you get, when her ale and food could not suffice. So here you've got just, here it's the modal could, it precedes not. And what you find in modern Danish is the order below, where you get when she not could go. So the change that happened in English to regular, what we call main verbs, non-auxiliary verbs, that is, they stopped being able to occur to the left of negation. In the Scandinavian languages, it was a much more thoroughgoing change in that all verbs stopped being able to proceed to the left to precede negation. So even auxiliaries like could have to follow negation in modern Danish. This is illustrated for Danish, but this is true also of Swedish. It's true of Norwegian, at least the standard languages. So this looks like a change that's happened possibly, certainly independently, and it looks like at least a similar change in these two sets of Germanic languages. We're starting to understand a bit about the process of these changes, but this raises the question, a really profound question, as to why languages ever change. Because on the one hand, we've got this very well-established fact that change happens. On the other hand, we've got another extremely well-established fact, and that is that children are extremely good at acquiring language. They're not just good, they're very, very accurate. So if children acquire the language accurately that they're hearing around them, so one generation is able to replicate the language which is being spoken by the previous generation, how is it that language ever changes? You would then predict that a language should be very, very stable. And trying to understand this, some of the facts that have emerged, and this is only become clear actually in the last 20 years are some other facts about how languages change. One of these facts is that syntactic change typically takes quite a long time. So this is not something that happens from one generation to the next. Typically, syntactic changes, and this is certainly true of the change in the placement of the verb in English, that took well more than 100 years to go to completion. To go from a situation for where everyone is saying they rebelled not, to a situation where everyone is saying they did not rebel. And similarly for Danish, we know that it took several hundred years to go from a situation where negation always followed the verb to where it always preceded it. So it's a gradual process. And the other thing that's important to understand is that the process of change all the way through is marked by variation. That doesn't mean that whenever you've got variation, necessarily you have change. That's a debated issue. But certainly, whenever you've got change, there will be periods of variation. And crucially, that's not just variation when you look at the whole population. It's variation when you look at the individuals in the population. So this is something which has got quite a bit of work to establish. A lot of people have the idea that the way syntactic change might spread through a population is it might happen that one child starts speaking a different way, and the gradual change is that in the next generation maybe 10 children adopt that speech, and it spreads throughout the population in that way. But you've got each individual is quite consistent, and what's gradual is the spread through the population of the new variant. But it turns out in all the changes that we know about, that's not what happened. What we know what actually happens is, as soon as what you see is a small percentage of the new variant. You start to see this in the evidence that you've got. It's not that you find one scribe out of 100 who's producing this new variant and the other 99 aren't. What you see is a few scribes here and there who are producing these manuscripts. Maybe 2% of the time they're using the new variant, and the other 98% they're using the old variant. And then a generation later, you find that 5% of the time the new variant is used, and 95% the old variant. So what you're seeing is variation in individuals, and what's changing from generation to generation is the proportion of the new versus the old variant. So if you've got these two orders of the verb with respect to negation, at first you'll find 98% the verb precedes negation, and just in 2% it follows it. And then in succeeding generations, those frequencies change. So when we're understanding change, that's part of what we have to try. That's part of it's part of the puzzle, but it's also going to be part of the solution, that we have to understand how change works in that way. And one possible explanation that people have given in different forms for the kind of word order change that I've just been describing for English and for Scandinavian is to suppose that there's two questions. One is, how do you get the variation in the first place? And that there might be different explanations. That might have something to do with language contact. It might have something to do with spontaneous production of new variants by children. That's a question I'm actually going to set aside here. But suppose we've got a situation where there is a small amount of variation in the population, and you've got children who are acquiring the language. What people have suggested would explain this gradual change is, suppose when you've got those two variants, that one of them is easier to process than the other. Crucially, the new one, if the change is going to go through. So we've got a new variant, and it turns out, so the hypothesis goes, it's somehow easier to process than the old variant. And the effect of that then would be that although children, let's say 95% of the time in their input, they're getting the old variant, and only 5% of the time they're getting the new variant. But the old variant is hard to process. So although 95 times out of 100, that's what their parents are saying to them, if it's hard to process, maybe a few of those they fail to understand. So effectively, their parents are using it 95% of the time, the old variant, the original. But the kids are effectively hearing it 90% of the time. If that happens over generations, those children will grow up, they themselves will speak to their children, and the 90% of the time they're using the old one, and 10% now of the time they're using the new one. And their kids again will have the same problems with the old one, and they will slightly underestimate how frequent it is. And so they themselves then will produce more of the new and less of the old. So that is one way that people have tried to understand how it is that you could have this kind of change and why it might be a gradual change over generations. So the idea is there's some kind of acquisitional bias against one of these orders. And in particular, the idea is that the order with the verb preceding negation is somehow harder, in this context at least, to process than the new variant. So that's it's actually quite a plausible and it's an interesting hypothesis. Unfortunately, of course, we don't have any information at all about what it was like to be a child early acquiring Middle English or early modern English or Middle Danish. The records that we have for historical linguistics always are very patchy. We've got written documents written by the few people who could write, and what we absolutely, you can guarantee we don't have is anything produced by small children. So we can make these hypotheses, but it's hard to look at them in any detail. And in fact, it's always the case when you're looking at historical change, that you make the best of the records that you've got, but your data are incredibly sparse. So we would love to be able to go back and see what was happening in Middle Danish and in Middle English. But at the moment we can't. On the other hand, what we can do is we can go to the Faroe Islands. Because what I discovered sitting in a library reading dissertations was the claim in the literature that something was happening in Faroese, in the Scandinavian language, that it was undergoing this change now. The change that in Danish was completed 2 centuries ago, and in English longer ago than that, is still going on in Faroese. And if this is true, this case, we get to actually go and talk to the people who are in the middle of the change. At least that would be the hope. And that was what got me excited when I was sitting in the library. So just to give you a little bit of background about the Faroes. Faroese is, or at least not so much about the Faroes, but about the language, since we're linguists, that's what we really worry about. So here's a map showing the Faroe Islands. As you can see, they're about halfway between Norway and Iceland. And the Faroe Islands were settled in the same wave of immigration so there they are, the same migrants who left Western Norway and wound up settling Iceland. Some of them stopped in the Faroe Islands. And as you can imagine, the Icelanders and the Faroese have different stories about the characteristics of people who decided not to carry on. So the language that these people were speaking is the ancestor of all of the Scandinavian languages and something we could call roughly Old Norse. Since then, the Faroes have come to be owned by Denmark. This was also true, of course, for Iceland. Iceland was also part of Denmark. Iceland got its independence. The Faroes don't have their independence. They are, I think it's called a quasi-autonomous region of Denmark. They have the same status that Greenland has. So the Faroes are still have quite a significant degree of contact with Denmark. As you can see, it's fairly remote. Whoops. So at least until traveling by plane was common, getting to the Faroes was not that easy from Denmark. People weren't that keen on going. It's pretty cold and wet up there. But there was still coming and going, and in more recent times, there's been a lot of communication between the Faroes and Denmark. So, for example, if you are going to go to university, if you study in the Faroes, so Faroese is the national language of the Faroes. It is spoken by the whole population, which is still not a lot of people. The entire population of the Faroe Islands is about 40,000. There's probably an additional 20,000 Faroese people in the diaspora, many of them in Denmark. Nevertheless, this is a language which is spoken by the whole population. It's the first language that children acquire at home. It's used in school. It's used in all official capacities. The government runs in Faroese. It's the status of the language is it's not endangered. It is, however, a small language and it's a small population, and therefore, when people want to pursue opportunities that they can't get in an island which only has a population of 40,000, the place they typically go to is Denmark. So, if you want to go to university and you want to study something other than Faroese language and culture, history, or marine biology, all of which are taught in a university in the Faroe Islands. But if you want to study medicine, for example, you're going to leave the country, at least for your studies, and you're probably going to go to Denmark. So there is, and people will go to Denmark also for work. People learn, although people acquire Faroese at home, and schooling is done in Faroese, is also the case that people learn Danish from a very young age, both at school and also through watching television, through playing video games. And so there's a lot of contact with Danish, and partly for that reason and for the many cultural ties, people go between the Faroes and Denmark quite a lot, so there's a lot of linguistic contact as well. Just in case you haven't heard the language spoken, this is what it sounds like. That's English. So that's what the language sounds like. Although actually there are distinct dialects within the Faroes, so that's not the northern dialect that you're hearing there. As a syntactician, though, this is not why we're interested in Faroese. As a phonologist, there's lots of interesting phonology going on. But this is what got me interested in Faroese. So when we look at, so what we're looking at is a change in where verbs are in the sentence. What makes it hard to do this is if you look at a main clause, at a root clause, an independent clause, then nothing is happening. All of these languages are the same. So here's Icelandic, Danish, and Faroese. And just a translation of Elin has not read the letter. And what you see in all cases here, the verb that's carrying tense precedes negation. Where I've got the verb have with an asterisk in front of it, that means it's impossible. So the only possible place to have the verb is before negation. Here it's an auxiliary verb, this is the perfect. But if you just had the verb read, so if you had Elin reads not the letter, that's the order you get. Reads not the letter in all of these languages. So nothing is going on here. That's the way it has been. That's the way, if you looked back 8 centuries, that's also what you'd find. But when we look in subordinate clauses, so not in root clauses, so one kind of subordinate clause is a relative clause. So the letter that Ellen has not read. In Icelandic, what you see is the order that you also found in Old Norse, and that is that the verb precedes negation. That just looks like the main clause, in fact, right? So that's the only possible order. The auxiliary is fine before negation, it would be bad after it. And again, if it wasn't an auxiliary, if we just had the letter that Ellen reads not, that's the order you'd get, reads not. In Danish, on the other hand, you get exactly the opposite. So in Danish, you would find that negation, which is clearly a related word, precedes the verb. And in modern Danish, that's the only possible order in this kind of subordinate clause. And what people reported for Faroese was that you would find both. That the verb could either precede or follow. And there were various claims made about how frequently people would do one or the other. And what certainly seemed to be the case is that the Danish order was replacing the Icelandic order. That was what was reported. And just to give us a way to talk about this, and the way that if you ever read any of this literature, you'll see, one way of thinking about this is to think of there being 3 places where the verb could go. The lowest position, the position most to the right, is after negation. There's a position between the subject and negation, and this people refer to as T for tense, because we think this is where tense is in the sentence. And then there's a position even higher, which is to the left of the subject. And that's a position, and this is called the C position for complementizer, for reasons that we don't need to think about here, I think. In root clauses, the verb winds up there, very, very far to the left and very high. But that's only in root clauses. So what you get is, there's the verb sitting in what's called V in situ, verb in place. The idea is that that's where verbs start, that that's the basic position for a verb to be. Very low, very much to the right of negation. This is the order that is only found in subordinate clauses. None of these languages do this in root clauses. But in subordinate clauses, in Danish, that's where you find the verb. And this is what seems to be the incoming order in Faroese. So the idea is that's the basic position for verbs. In contrast, there's the position that you find in Icelandic. This is where we say the verb is in the T position. So people talk about this as being V to T. You can talk about this as the verb having moved into this position. But we don't have to think in terms of movement if you don't want to. In this case, this is the order which you used to find in all the Scandinavian languages, which is still found in Icelandic, and which we think is the order you used to get in Faroese. One of the reasons, in fact, for thinking in terms of movement and talking about the low position to the right of negation as being the basic position, this also relates to this idea I mentioned to you that people said, well, maybe there's an acquisitional bias, that that's an easier order. And part of the intuition about that is to say, if that's the basic order for where the verb would be, that's what kids are first going to expect, is a way of thinking about it. So there's the second position the verb could be. And then, in this case, this is the highest position the verb could be. This is the position that occurs in root or main clauses in all of these languages, where the verb is even above the subject. Sometimes the subject also occurs even higher than you'd expected, in which case you just get the order subject, verb, and negation. But the reason we can tell that the verb is very high is that in a root clause, it doesn't have to be the subject you get first, as would be the case in all the Germanic languages apart from English. You can put something else in first position, like the letter, and then you would get the verb, and then you would get the subject. This part of the system has stayed the same in all of these languages. The part that's changing is this part. So what seems to be happening is, or what was claimed to be happening for Faroese, is that the order that you're getting in the lower case, the lower part there, where the verb precedes negation, is being replaced by the instance above. So that one is being replaced by that. So that was what we thought was happening with Faroese, at least what had been claimed in the literature. What kind of evidence did we have for this? Well, the first thing that the first time people tried to get a handle on this as to whether this was a syntactic change that was happening, whether something was happening historically, is you do what you do when you try to understand historical change, and you look at the history of the language, you look at records from the past of the language. And this is what a very eminent Icelandic linguist called Heycock started to do for Faroese. Now, you can't go very far back when you're looking at Faroese, because for a long time, Faroese was not a written language. It only started being written in the late 18th century. In between, Danish was written and Faroese was spoken. So one of the problems that we have with Faroese is that we can't get any written records between medieval times and the late 18th century. But Heycock made an attempt to see whether you could see a historical change going on here. And what he did was very systematic. He looked at authors from 3 different periods. So if you look at the columns, you'll see there were 3 authors who were born before 1900, 5 who were born between 1900 and 1939, and 3 who were born between 1939 and 3050. He looked at the frequency with which they used one order or the other. He looked only at subordinate clauses, because nothing is happening in root clauses. And he looked only at clauses where you've got a verb and negation or some other adverb that's similar to negation. And do you get the verb preceding the adverb, or do we get the adverb preceding the verb? So you can see the 2 different numbers. Each column is divided into 2. And crucially, it turns out, the only cases that help when we're understanding this are the bottom 2 rows. Because in each row, you've got a different kind of subordinate clause. And one of the extra difficulties here is that the order that you can get in root clauses, you can also get in some subordinate clauses. Some subordinate clauses behave a lot like root clauses. So those, again, nothing will change. And it turns out those top three rows are the type of subordinate clause which actually behaves a bit like a main clause. So data from those doesn't really help. You've got to look at the really honest-to-God subordinate clauses. And those here are indirect questions and relative clauses. And what you see here, if you look at the percentages, it looks as though you can indeed see, over time, a change. You're going from 60% use of the verb preceding the adverb to 38% to 0. The case of relative clauses is a bit of a blip. It goes from 40% to 45 to 0. But you can see, so that looks like, that's nice, we've got a change over time. But what you can also see from this is something that you should always pay attention to if ever you are looking at somebody talking about frequency, and that is never trust anybody who only gives you the percentages. Always look for the n, look for the actual number. Because what happens if you look at the actual numbers here is they are tiny. You're looking, that 60% is 3 examples. Right? The other 40% was 2 examples. Right? So we've got 3 versus 2, 3 versus 5, 0 versus 2. That is a very small amount of data. And one of the things that, and this is not to criticize the people who did this work. This actually illustrates one of the issues about dealing with when you're looking at syntactic change. There's a reason why those numbers are so small, and it's not because Heycock wasn't doing a lot of work. It's because the frequency with which this kind of construction occurs is very low. And this is one of the difficulties with looking at syntactic change as opposed to phonetic or phonological change. You don't have to listen to somebody for a very long time before you're going to get a token of them saying the consonant p. It just doesn't take a lot of text before you get an example of that. But you can listen to someone for quite a long time, and I know this because I've done it. before you get an example of a subordinate clause, and not just any old subordinate clause, because some of those subordinate clauses behave like main clauses. We need relative clauses. We need indirect questions. So we need an indirect question, we need a relative clause, and it's got to have negation in it. That just doesn't happen all that much. If you look in texts, you have to look through several pages before you find one example. If you listen, you have to listen for several minutes, maybe half an hour before you find one example. So this is one reason why looking at syntactic variation is harder than looking at, in some sense at least, harder than looking at phonological phonetic variation. Our data are sparser. And when we look at corpora, which is a very valid thing to do, and that's essentially what's being done here, this is one of the limitations, that some of the crucial data are sparse. What's interesting about this is it also means for children, the data is sparse. So given that this was the state of what we knew, it was clear we were going to have to do some other kind of way of getting data. And indeed, Percival de Fransen began this, and also a Faroese linguist called Hjalmar Petersen, he also started working with this, where instead of just looking at what people have produced, you go and speak to them, and you present them with examples, and you ask them whether this is possible or not possible. So you get data from judgments. And the advantage of that is you don't have to wait for half a day until they produce a subordinate clause with negation in it, which you missed because you were out getting your coffee. You present people with such cases, and then you get their reactions. So we decided that we were going to have to do this on a systematic basis. It had been done somewhat sporadically before, so we set a project where we were going to do this systematically. To do this, we actually had to go to the Faroe Islands. So that's what we did. There are the Faroe Islands, and we did most of our work in the main island, which you can see is the largest one there, with the capital Tórshavn in it. But we actually also investigated the speakers from other areas in case there was a dialect difference, but it turns out there isn't. Just to give you some idea of what the place looks like, there's the capital, Tórshavn, where most people live, and there's another view of it. Other people, so if you're not living in the capital, there are villages all around the islands. All of the islands except for one are inhabited. This is an island just off Tórshavn, in fact. There's another view of it. This is actually a remarkable piece of cultural history. This is people on board on the deck of the ferry leaving Tórshavn doing a circle dance that is still danced in, these dances are still danced in the Faroe Islands. It's a very simple dance, but you dance it to people singing. And you dance people singing ballads. And the way you dance is affected by what's happening in the ballads. So the steps are very simple, but you dance more enthusiastically if you're killing somebody, and less enthusiastically if it's, someone's fallen in love with somebody else. These dances used to be danced all over Europe. It's only survived pretty much in the Faroe Islands. And the ballads that people sing while to people dancing have also are part of our evidence for what the history of the language is like. Here's another picture of an island just off Tórshavn. I also use this to illustrate one fact about Faroese society, which is rather distinct from Iceland in that religion is still quite important in the Faroe Islands. So Christianity plays a stronger role in the islands, and every village has a church. Every village also has a football pitch. It's the second religion, some people said. This is my favorite football pitch in the whole world, actually. If you miss by just a few yards, your ball is on its way to America. It's really spectacular. The islands, as you see, people live on these different islands. They're connected, historically also always connected by boat. And there are still ferries connecting all of the islands. Every ferry comes with its own collie dog. There's the captain of that particular boat. This is also a traditional hat the guy is wearing. The only person I ever saw wearing one. So this is traditionally how people got around. I'm actually going to spare you the most terrifying video of a ferry coming in. There are now spectacularly good roads, also quite scary actually, because the islands are very, very hilly. And the islands are connected. The way you get around the islands is most of these roads go through these incredible system of tunnels. So it used to be the case that the only way to get from village to village was by boat or by walking over the hills. And they're now connected by these tunnels, some of which go under the fields. And that was one such that I was cycling through. That has had an effect clearly on the dialects within the Faroe Islands. The ease or difficulty of transportation clearly affects linguistic variation. A gratuitous picture of sheep only. The economy of the Faroe Islands used to depend entirely on wool. And there are still more sheep in the islands than there are people. Wool, however, is worth almost nothing. So in fact, I've been there, when you see piled beside the roads, you see people burning it, because you have to shear the sheep because otherwise they're uncomfortable, but the stuff is worth nothing. What now matters is fish. The economy of the islands depends entirely on fishing, although there is the tremendous hope that they're going to find oil. And finally, this is a picture of the Department of Faroese Language at the university, where some of the people who do research on the language work, including one linguist here on the right, Jegvani Loen Jakobsen, who is one of the people who helped us in our work. So that was the country that we came to, and this is what we did. So we were interested then in trying to find out, was it really the case that this language was in the process of change? And what actually worried me about this was the more I listened to people and the more modern texts I studied, the more it looked as though perhaps we were already too late, and that perhaps the change was already completed. But we wanted to see if we could find this out. So what we did was, we did this process of asking people to judge sentences. We would give them examples of where the verb preceded negation, where the verb followed negation. We did this in a completely systematic way, so we had minimal comparisons, we had filler examples, and we used a technique that, if you're interested in, you could ask me about. But essentially, rather than saying you have to make a choice of good or bad, or even you have a 3-point scale, we asked people to rate sentences relative to each other. Because it turns out that one of the reasons we're doing this is that people find it not that hard to say, that sentence is much worse than that sentence. Then they find that easier than saying, this sentence is good and this sentence is bad. So people give relative judgments relatively easily compared to giving absolute judgments. So that was what we were asking. And we looked both at adults and at children. We used a slightly different technique for children, which I'll get to in a minute. And because we thought there would be variation in population, we wanted to get a reasonable number of people. So we got 90 adults helped us with this, and we also spoke to 41 children. And we had two groups of adults from two different it might have been two different dialect areas, but it turns out that this wasn't relevant. We looked at 3 different age groups, and we also looked at different age groups of children. And clearly, what we were trying to do with the age groups of adults is, if there was a change in progress, what we would expect to find is that the oldest speakers would still be using more of the old form than the youngest speakers. And if you know the sociolinguistic literature, this is called a change in apparent time, where if you can't go back in time to actually record, you don't have recordings of even 50 years ago, you record older and younger speakers, because it seems that people settle on their linguistic system, more or less, at some point in early adulthood, and change less after that. So the way an 80-year-old speaks gives you some idea of how a 30-year-old spoke 50 years ago. So we tried to do that, looked at different age groups. And what we also did was, as well as looking at Faroese, with some of our work, we also looked at Icelandic and at Danish, because Icelandic kind of represents the way Faroese used to be. Danish represents the way it seems to be going. And we thought if we did a comparison with those, we could see whereabouts Faroese has got. So we also looked at Danish and Icelandic subjects. And what we looked at, so we were looking at two variables. So one was what's the order of the verb with respect to negation. And then the other thing, which I haven't mentioned so far, is we actually looked at different adverbs. We looked at negation. We also looked at adverbs like perhaps and adverbs like often, which might be at different positions in the sentence. And we're always looking at relative clauses. And what we found is, what you would hope to find, is that there's an interaction between those two variables. That is to say, whether you prefer the verb before negation depends on which language you're speaking, which had better be the case given what we know. So here's the results. What you're seeing here is the judgments. The exact scale needn't bother you so much at this point. But basically, high on the scale means it's the higher it is, the better it is, the lower, the worse it is. And what you see on the left-hand side is the order where the verb precedes the adverb. What you see on the right-hand side is the order where the adverb precedes the verb. And so here's the three different languages. So in Icelandic, that's the dark red. And what you can see is clearly, Icelanders want the verb to precede negation, right? We knew that before. Now we've confirmed that the method replicates what we knew. That's good. And what we see in Danish, which is the yellow line, is exactly the opposite, which is also what you'd expect. Danish, completely, people want the verb to follow negation. And the interesting result was Faroese, right? So that's the orange line. And what you can see there is we're not quite too late. Not quite. Because although there is a significant difference here, and what you can see is that people, clearly modern speakers, they prefer the order where the verb where the verb follows negation. So it is true that the language has it's closer to Danish now in this respect than it is to Icelandic. But it hasn't got all the way. It's still distinguishable in that the dispreference for the old order is weaker, and the preference for the new order is also weaker. So what we were able to show here was that the change looks like it's very near the end, but it also looks like it isn't quite at the end. We also looked at, but here I'll maybe skip over this briefly, we looked at whether it made a difference whether you looked at negation or other adverbs. And what we actually found here was, so this is how good it is if a verb precedes negation, if it precedes perhaps, and if it precedes a low adverb like often. What you can see is Icelandic, they just want the verb to precede all of them. And the Danes, they hate the verb preceding. They're right at the bottom there. And what we actually see about Faroese is it seems to matter whether it's negation or whether it's some other adverb. So that's a quite interesting pattern, actually. That with respect to negation, it's almost like Danish. With these other adverbs, it's different. So this is a system then that makes Faroese look like it's not just it's getting close to Danish, it's doing it in a nuanced way that the adverbs behave differently with respect to negation. So I'll just leave it at that for this. But now let me come to the generational issue. As I said, we know from the history of Scandinavian, and we know from Faroese, that this order with the verb preceding negation was an option. And here I'm just citing, so one of the people who did really important work on Faroese, a woman called Diane Jonas. She talked about two dialects, and she also thought that there was an age difference. She said that older speakers produced more of the verb before negation, younger speakers less. That's what you'd expect, that's the change in apparent time. So that's what we expected to find. Right? We expected to find that on the whole, people would prefer the new order, but that older speakers would have less strong preference than young. But actually, that's not what we found. So here, this is actually looking at 3 different kinds of subordinate clause. So this is, say that he not came, deny that he not came, and ask if he not came. I won't go into the differences between these in particular. What's being graphed here is how much do people what's your strength of preference for having the verb after negation? So the higher up it is, the more you would rather have the verb after negation. And the 3 different colours are the 3 different age groups. So 18 to 30, 40 to 55, and over 65. And the crucial thing here is that actually, although those don't coincide exactly, statistically they're exactly the same. You can't tell those generations apart. There's no statistical difference between the oldest speakers and the youngest speakers. This we were not expecting, I have to say. So the generational effect we expected to find, we didn't find. And in fact, we ran a lot of different tests, and we never found it. So that seemed very surprising. Given that we'd seen that Faroese looks like it's not at the end of the change, and yet there doesn't seem a difference between the generations, well, how would that be? And one way of thinking about this is to think about the rates of change. One of the other things that's very well established now about linguistic change, and about syntactic change in particular, is that the speed of the change follows what's called an S-shaped curve. So what you find is, so what's tracking here in a schematic way, so on this axis you've got time, and then the line you're seeing there is the frequency of a new variant. And what you find is at the beginning, it increases quite slowly, and then in the middle you've got a rapid change, and then towards the end, the change is again very slow. So what it looks like is, so when you reach the very end, you've got 100% of the new variant that changes over. And the question, and it looks as though Faroese is somewhere right at that very end. Right? Every PowerPoint presentation has a gratuitous piece of animation, and that was mine. So Faroese is somewhere right at the very end. So the idea would be that the reason you're not seeing a difference between the generations is because the change now is so slow that the generational difference is minimal. And our evidence that change hasn't gone to completion is that we still see the language isn't quite behaving like Danish. I'd now like to, before I finish, I do want to say something about these children, because this was also a great surprise to us. Going back to the beginning, I said that what people have thought about changes is that children find it harder to acquire the verb preceding negation, possibly because that involves a movement, than the verb after negation. And if that's true, then absolutely, when you look at young children, right, they should be of all of the speakers that we've got, they should be the least likely to produce the old order, because that's the one that's hard. So we'd absolutely expect children should be furthest along. And in fact, what I expected to find, having looked at the adult data, was that children would be like the Danish speakers, effectively, that they would have lost the change would be over for them. But that's not what we found. Now, with children, you have to use different techniques. So we did 2 things with children. We got judgments from children. We asked children to tell us what was possible and what wasn't possible. But we couldn't do it the same way with adults. What we did instead was we showed them animations featuring familiar cartoon characters, which I can't show you because of copyright. And they were told these characters were learning Faroese and they sometimes made mistakes. And after each little dialogue, they were asked whether the last character to speak said something that was right, or should they be corrected when they was it wrong? And we gave them training for this. And of course there were examples then, sometimes with a verb before negation, sometimes with after. And then there was some other stuff which we don't need to worry about. So that was asking children to say, is that good, is it not good? Could you, is that Faroese or not? Then we also needed to get children to actually produce sentences. Remember, we've got to get them to produce subordinate clauses with negation in them. That is not that easy. And what we did was we actually borrowed a technique that's been used by some Norwegian experimenters. And this involved the child being read a story and then told that somebody else had a very good memory for the story. The child was reminded about various events and told to ask the assistant if the assistant remembered them, so that the child would begin the question with, do you remember? And then after that, you're going to get an embedded question. And we set things up very carefully so that there would be negation in that embedded question. So here's an example. So that the person says, so this is a story about Pippi Longstocking. It says, now, do you remember? It says, you remember the little ape? And the horse wasn't allowed to help because he had to be outside, right? Do you think Goodney remembers why? Do you think Goodney remembers why? Why can't the horse help? Ask Goodney. Do you remember? And the child says, do you remember why the horse not be allowed in? Right? So the child, we've successfully convinced this child that what we want, well, we got them to say, without us having said it first, because it's crucial that the investigator shouldn't produce a subordinate clause with negation, because then he might copy them. So we have to set it up so that the investigator only ever used root clauses if they had questions. The kid produces a subordinate clause with negation. In this case, they produce, this is an example, they produced the new order. So here's the experiment going on. So this is, on the right is Zacharias Svabo Hansen, who was one of the people who I was working with on this research on Faroese, and the rather bored-looking kid on the left. Mostly they enjoyed it, I tell you. And this is what we found. So here's the production. So group 1, group 2, group 3. These are kids, this is the youngest age group. So these are 5 to 6, 6 to 7. And the oldest age group is 2 years older than that. So these kids have not yet gone to school, and the oldest kids have gone to school. And there's 2 years gap there. And this is in terms of their judgment. So this is, did Mickey Mouse, I'm giving it away, right? Speak right or wrong when they said this. And what we find is that with the youngest group, and these are the kids who are supposed to find verb before negation hard, they accepted verb before negation 60% of the time. Slightly less the next group, although that's actually not significantly different. The older group is starting to behave more like adults, right, who don't like that order. Now that's accepting the sentences. And this is accepting, how much would they accept the other order, with negation before the verb? And it turns out that all of the age groups, they liked this absolutely fine. They liked it best, the oldest kids. So the oldest kids are behaving much more like the adults. The youngest kids, you can see that there's a slight increase in their liking for this new order. One thing that you could definitely worry about when you're looking at this is you look at the youngest kids and you think, they can't manage this task. Right? It would be very easy to say, look, you'll ask them to say whether it's good or not, and they just want to make you happy. Right? So they say, yeah, it's fine, right? Whatever, it's fine. And so they're accepting both. And that would be a reasonable thing to think about these, that this is not telling you very much. However, remember we also had production, when the kids were producing these sentences, not having heard them. And what we found with that, so this is the frequency with which they produced the old order. And what we also found is that 50% of the time, the younger children were producing it. So this was not, they're not just trying to make you happy, they don't know what we want, right? And then it drops sharply. After they've gone to school, these older kids now effectively never produce this. So they're behaving like the adults. And the other reason we have to think that it's not just the kids can't manage this task is, as well as those sentences, there were lots of other ones, including ones which were ungrammatical for other reasons. And there's that last little black thing that's the proportion of time that kids, when faced with a sentence which was really ungrammatical, said, yeah, it's fine. And even the youngest children didn't accept those, or very rarely. So we have reason to think that when 70% of the time, or when 60% of the time they're saying verb for negation is fine, it's not just because they accept anything, because they really don't. So what we actually see then is a pattern in children which is not what you'd expect on that original account. That is to say, so on the one hand, we've now been able to see that Faroese, it's right at the tail end of a change, of this historical change, but it's not quite there, but very close. And I think what for me turned out to be some of the most interesting is that what we found about the children was that they're not doing what's expected under that account that I gave you as a plausible one about syntactic change. That is, if what was driving this change was that young children found the verb negation order hard to process, is they ought to start with very low levels of that and stay low. And instead what it looks like is, what you've got with younger children is they start doing both and accepting both, and the process of acquisition is losing one of them. So what that tells us then is we've learned a little bit more about this historical change. We've learned that it's happening in Faroese. We've learned it's towards the end. And crucially, we've learned that an acquisitional bias in children, at least we have some evidence. You would clearly want to duplicate this, but we've got some evidence that a bias in children against this V to T, this higher position for the verb, is not the reason that this is happening. So, and if it isn't what's happening in Faroese, we have at least some evidence that that isn't also what was happening in Middle Danish either. So we have some evidence from the present that helps us understand the past. At the moment, what it's telling us is what we thought might be an explanation is an explanation. So the next thing we have to do is what's the alternative? And that is something which I'm actively working on together with one of my colleagues actually at Newcastle, Joel Wallenberg. So that's where we've got to really with Faroese. If you're interested in any of what we found, if you're interested in working in this language about Faroese, I've got some links from my webpage, but I would invite you to get in touch with me if you want to know any more about this. And other than that, I would just say, when you sit in the library thinking about theoretical thoughts, always entertain the possibility they might take you to places you hadn't expected to go. And when you get a chance, you should definitely take it. Thank you very much.
Similar processes, like linguistic parallels in other isolated nations, perhaps in the Caribbean or Southeast Asia?
So, I have not studied the languages of those areas. So there's linguistic change going on everywhere. In fact, if you're looking for change, the typical place you find it is not in the isolated areas. So one of the reasons it's not an accident, I would think, that if you look at Scandinavian, the languages that changed first are the mainland languages. Faroese is happening next, and Icelandic has changed the least. And in terms of remoteness from other languages, that's decline. Typically, change happens where there's contact. The more isolated you are, the less change you get. Do you have a particular reason to ask about those areas?
No, not a particular reason. I was just wondering if you would consider Faroese an actual unique phenomenon, or more of an interesting case study of a universal linguistic idea.
So I think it's, the way I would think about it is that it's every language has something unique about it. There's no question. But what I think we see in Faroese is the same kind of thing that we see in other places. So I think this is a case study, and it's a case study of a general phenomenon. So part of the interest for me, on the one hand, it was fantastically interesting to learn something about the society, learn something about a particular language. But on the other hand, what was really interesting was that this was a chance to see a process which, if I was looking at English, I could only see from looking at documents from the 15th century. So in that sense, I think it's interesting because it's an example of a general question, which is why languages change, right? Why and how they change. Yeah.
About the children changing or not changing around, could it be an explanation where we can include Danish? Because as far as I've understood it, correct me if I'm wrong, in the main clause you have the verb and then the negation,
Yeah.
which is not the case in Danish.
No, in Danish main clause is also like that.
Excuse me, yeah. And then the children use verb plus negation in a subordinate clause, which is not the same in Danish.
Yeah.
But suddenly they start learning Danish at a later stage. I don't know when they start. Do they start at 10 or 13?
They start at 9, I think.
9. And then suddenly their input starts changing, starts shifting. Then they suddenly say that the negative precedes the verb all of a sudden. Could Danish be a contributing factor to that change?
Yeah, it's absolutely possible. That, and one of the things that's really difficult in studying Faroese is trying to tease apart what might be the effect of the influence of Danish and what might be independent changes. Because one of the real difficulties with this is that these are related languages, and Danish already underwent this change, as I said. Right? So it's possible that there's an effect of Danish, of the kids being exposed more to Danish, although they're actually exposed to Danish from very young, because a lot of their children's stories and video stuff is also in Danish. But if that is what's happening, that then would tell us that then contact is much more important than these issues about any acquisitional bias. And in fact, it's really fighting against the acquisitional bias. The limitation in the sense of that explanation is when you look at the history of Danish, it also underwent this change, but it didn't have any Danish to be in contact with. So this is a change that happened in Danish without an exemplar. So you're quite right that to understand, you would really like to tease apart in Faroese what the effect of the contact is. And Hjalmar Petersen has been doing some work where he's looked at the Faroese community in Denmark and the Faroese community in the Faroes. Unfortunately, most of his data come uniquely from the Faroese community in Denmark. And you can see the effect of Danish there, but you actually can't tell because you have nothing to compare it to. So to really answer your question, you would really like to try to find speakers who have more or less contact with Danish. Unfortunately, that's very, very hard. But it's a very good question, and contact clearly has some effect. I'm not certain whether it's all though.
What I thought when you said that the bias would be against the main clause order, it seems to me is you cannot really say it's easier or it's more difficult because.
So one thing that one thing you might expect, it's certainly true that if you just looked at the frequency of finding verbs preceding negation in all of these languages, that's by far the most common order because that's what root clauses do. So in that sense, it makes the change in subordinate clauses, even more surprising, right, because they're changing away. But there's one thing that people thought might be happening with these children is maybe what's happening with the children is they just don't understand the difference between a root and a subordinate clause. And so the reason you're getting lots of the verb coming before negation is because they're just treating it like it's a main clause. And so that pattern that we saw the children gradually changing is just that they learn that difference. But one reason for thinking that's not actually what's going on with these kids is if you actually look at the questions they would use. So a root question, you'd say, would be why. Why goes the horse not? Right? And in a subordinate, so if they were producing roots but in subordinate clauses, you'd expect to find that order. Why and then the verb, right? Because that's what you do in a root clause. They never did that in subordinate clauses. They always said either. So do you remember why the horse not goes? Or do you remember why the horse goes not? They produce one or two of the other, but neither of those is possible in a main clause. So that suggests to me and to the researchers who look at this in Norwegian that somewhat surprisingly, they're perfectly able to distinguish. They don't have any difficulty in distinguishing the roots of subordinate clauses. So that interference isn't just what's going on. But you're right, it's clearly, and I think it's a very important issue, that the evidence that children have got for what should happen in a subordinate clause is infrequent, right? So it's frustrating as a linguist, but for a child, it also means they've got really quite limited evidence, and that might be why it takes them so long. I mean, it's really quite late. 6 years old and you're not producing speech like an adult, that's late as far as syntax is concerned, and that might be one of the reasons that it's so infrequent.
Thank you very much to you for coming and to Caroline for this awesome lecture.